Welcome back. Now just 4 months from Election Day, another bipartisan group has formed called the Democracy Defense Project.
The goal, the group says, is to increase confidence in the state's elections. Board members include former Democratic Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes and former Republican Attorney General J.B. Van Hollen, both who join us now.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
We're first going to get to a couple news of the day items. Former Lieutenant Governor, I want to start with President Biden and this post-debate conversation. I'm curious from your perspective, should he step aside and should someone else replace him?
Well, that's not my decision to make, and the president has not had the best debate performance. We know that, but a lot of people don't have great debate performance. But what we do have to judge is 2 presidential performances, and I know which one was absolutely better, and I know which one that when it comes down to it in November, which one I'll be deciding. That's going to be with the President of the United States.
What are you hearing from delegates or young Democratic voters here in Milwaukee?
Well, this isn't a new conversation, and I've said before on television that we weren't tuning into an episode of Saved by the Bell. We get it. There aren't 2 young people on the stage that are discussing ideas. And I started a political action committee specifically to get more young people engaged in politics, to get diverse candidates involved in politics. And that's the work I'm going to continue to do, because there will be another election after this one if we save our democracy. And we're going to continue to be sure to build up those leaders all across the state and all across the country.
Can he still win Wisconsin?
I think the president can certainly win Wisconsin, but it's not going to be easy. This is a state that comes down to 20,000 or 30,000 votes, and he's going to have to work hard to make that happen.
JB, I want to ask your thoughts on former President Donald Trump not being able to say full stop in last week's debate that he would accept the results of the November election.
Well, I think he did, actually. I think that when he said that if the election is fair, that he accepts it. And I think that's the way everybody is. If anybody said that the election isn't fair, nobody would accept it. And that's really why Mandela and I are here, is to tell people that we do have fair elections here in Wisconsin. And that people should get out there and vote for their selected candidate. And when they do that, everybody's going to be able to accept the results here.
Is that a new benchmark, not to be able to say yes, full stop, but to say if there is a fair election?
Unfortunately, that's been a benchmark for most politicians for most of all time. Their unwillingness to say a firm yes or no to anything. But I think it's a fair disclaimer to be able to say that the flip side of that, meaning if it's unfair, I'm not going to accept it. So I think he gave a pretty clear answer, and I don't think President Biden would have said he would have accepted an unfair election result either.
You're one of the prominent Republicans in this new bipartisan organization. It's called the Democracy Defense Project. What is your main goal as a Republican ahead of November?
Well, I think it's really the same as Mandela's as a Democrat. We are trying to convince people to get out and vote because their vote will count. We do have fair elections here in Wisconsin. We have local poll workers who work extremely hard to make sure we have fair elections here in Wisconsin. And if you want to make sure that your chosen candidate has a better chance of prevailing in what Mandela has rightly said is a close state between red and blue, the surest way to do that is to vote, not to stay home and say you're afraid your vote's not going to count.
I want you guys to flip the tables for a second. Mandela, I'll start with you. What specifically do you think Republicans need to hear ahead of November?
Well, I think they need to hear from leaders like former Attorney General J.B. Van Hollen, who is going around the state, who's going on television, who's going in the media, talking about having faith and trust in the process. Given that our poll workers working so incredibly hard, have been faced with threats that they should not have to be dealing with. We're talking about people who are volunteering, people who are showing up because they believe in the cause of democracy. And when you get people like J.B. Van Hollen who are going out there, I hope that other Republicans across the state have as much courage as him to step out and do the same thing, instead of believing what a sore loser has to say after he didn't win the election in 2020, going around saying that it was stolen from him. That wasn't the case. And so many people in public office, in elected office, who may not have necessarily believed him, but are going along with that lie for their own political fortunes.
JB, I'll let you flip it as well. What do Democrats need to hear ahead of November?
Well, I think it's the same thing. If you've got people who are on opposite side of the political spectrums, like the Lieutenant Governor and myself, who are out there saying that we do have fair elections and that your vote is going to count, that they need to get out there and vote. The surest way to harm your own candidate, in the Democrats' case would be President Biden, is to not get out and vote for him. So people in both parties, if they listen to the squabbling over whether the elections are fair, will just get out and vote. They're going to do the best thing they can possibly do to make sure that they are fair.
A message you're working to get out is part of a new organization called the Democracy Defense Project. Former Republican Attorney General J.B. Van Hollen, former Democratic Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes. Gentlemen, thank you both for your time on this holiday weekend.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Up next, the final countdown. The Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, now 1 week away. One of the big forces in securing the convention is with us next.